Okay. Our guest speaker today, Randy Partain, moved to Houston 16 years ago with his wife, Joy. And, you have a name tag. So that's he earned a master's and doctorate in music composition at Rice. Spent many years working as a church musician, and he gradually became more open about his beliefs as a secular humanist and sought an environment where he could be more authentic. Strangely enough, that journey led him to be the lone atheist at a local evangelical Christian seminary, where he's preparing for ministry in the Unitarian Universalist Church. So this is a first for us to have an atheist evangelical seminarian. Which is so let's give a warm welcome to Randy Partain.
It's a real honor to be here with you this morning.
I want to get this right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There we go.
Okay. I really believe strongly in what you guys are doing here, and it's a treat for me to be able to share in it in a small way this morning. I do spend a lot of my time around Christians, and some of them are very vocal Christians, and I try to be very vocal about my secular humanism without being overly confrontational. So I value open dialogue with folks, but it has certainly taught me how to be rooted in what I believe and to be able to express that clearly. And I spend some of my free time when I don't have a lot of reading to do for classes. I spend some of that time reading enough atheists and secular humanists to keep that thread of thought going and to keep feeding that. So I read Sam Harris quite a bit and listen to what he has to say about ethics while I'm getting what the evangelical Christian side has to say about ethics, and sometimes the two strangely meet up for strange reasons. They're founded on different things, but the things that they consider to be ethical wind up being really similar sometimes. One of the things that bugs me a bit is that it seems like we're just creating a different set of rules. You know, Sam Harris talks about what the rules are from a different standpoint, but we're still talking about rules. And I think rules are valuable for us. I mean, we have this impression that if everybody plays by the same set of rules, then everybody stays safe and has more fun and life goes more smoothly. Whether we're playing board games with our families, or whether we're talking about sporting events, or whether we're talking about driving, or whether we're talking about business, we have this sense that rules really help us do those things more successfully. I'm not going to advocate today that we eliminate rules. What I want to suggest is that we can be a little more conscious about where our rules come from. And I think there are two kinds of rules that we see in our lives that we experience every day. Some of those are external rules and some of those are internal rules. Some of the rules are put on us by society or by other people around us, and some of the rules are things that we have come up with in our own lives that we say, this is something that I'm going to live by. And some of those external rules are meant for our well-being. They're things, like traffic laws. We have those rules so that everybody is safer on the road. Those rules are there for everybody's well-being. Rules about how we treat people's personal property are there for our well-being. There aren't any societies that really thrive on blatant theft of other people's property. We have a sense of ownership, and we have some rules around that help us feel safe with the things that we possess and help us have some boundaries with other people. But some of the external rules around us can be a bit misguided. One of the rules that I think is changing, but it was a hard and fast rule for people in earlier generations, was that you always obey authority figures. And I think even now, if a uniformed police officer tells you something, then you're inclined to think that you ought to do that. There's a certain rule that we've been taught that if an authority figure tells you something, you have to do that. Money equals success is another rule that I think people live by. If you want to be successful, you have to make more money. If you're making more money, then you're successful. There's a rule there about how to be successful that I think a lot of people live by. And of course, there are social rules, like if you can't say something nice, don't say it. See, we all know these things. The purpose of those kinds of rules aren't necessarily for our well-being. It may be more about avoiding confrontation in society, helping people be be calmer, helping people have an easier time in relating to other folks. But it's not necessarily about any kind of deep happiness. It's more about just keeping the peace. And I think some of our internal rules wind up being misguided sometimes as well. We make up rules for how we're going to live our lives, sometimes based on fear. Sometimes we have these lies that we tell about ourselves or lies that we tell about other people, and we make up rules based on those beliefs that wind up being a bit misguided. Or I think a lot of the rules that we make up have to do with ameliorating shame. At least when you read some of these ethics books, a lot of it seems to be how to ameliorate this shame that we have, that we carry around, especially if you grew up in a religious environment where shame was a big part of that belief system. Things like never take a job for less money than what you make now. That seems like good advice. If that's the rule of your career, then you might be very successful if you equate money and success. But if you say, I'm never going to take a job for less money than what I make now, you're equating your value with a dollar figure. And I don't think that human value is based on a monetary figure. So that rule might be a little bit misguided. Maybe there's something else that would have value about a job that you would take aside from just the salary that comes with it. Some people have a rule that they always put other people first. And that seems like a really nice thing to do. That seems like a really, you want to be that kind of person who always puts other people's needs before your own. But again, where is your value in that? You have to earn your value by doing things for other people, or are you not worth your own effort? I mean, it's great to do nice things for other people, but how are you valuing yourself in doing that? What's the reason behind it? There's rules about not being rude. We don't want to ever offend people. I don't want to say anything or do anything that's going to upset somebody else. And that might be a little misguided too, because I don't think any social change that has ever happened in the history of humanity has happened because people weren't upsetting someone. I think that somebody somewhere had to offend somebody else in order for the kinds of social justice issues that we're all pretty enthusiastic about to have happened in the course of human history. I don't know if there are some other societal rules or some internal rules that you think we might obey thoughtlessly that just spring to mind. But you know the kind of things that I'm talking about. My experience in seminary has been that you can't really talk about a faith tradition and include everybody in that faith tradition. There are a lot of different Christianities. There are a lot of different Islams. There are a lot of different Buddhisms. So I encounter Christians at, I'm going to Houston Graduate School of Theology. It's the only seminary in Houston where a Unitarian Universalist can enroll. So that's where I'm going. But there are some really conservative folks there, and there are some really liberal folks there in terms of their religious beliefs. There are some people who talk about building the kingdom of God or participating in building the kingdom of God. And when they talk about that, and I get them to define what they mean by that, they're not really describing anything different than the kind of world that I want to participate in creating. They just use a different language for it. And they might base it on something different than what I base my dream, my vision for the world on. But some of the folks that I have heard suggest that an atheist or a non-believer should not or cannot look in the Bible and interpret Scripture because they just don't have the capacity for that. They're not coming from the right standpoint. The Bible's not for you. And what I have found in all of my papers and all of my discussions there is that there actually is some human value in looking at those stories, and there are some things that we can derive from them even if we discard the mythology of what's there. One of the really interesting things is that in the New Testament there are some descriptions about the early Christian church and how they were identifying themselves. They had to wrestle with certain rules that they had inherited from their Jewish background. They had these dietary laws, they had rules about circumcision, and the New Testament has these discussions, sometimes arguments back and forth, sometimes some really offensive things get said because they don't know what to do with these rules. Do we still have to follow this set of rules that we inherited from being Jewish people, or are we not Jewish people anymore? What's our identity? Are we creating something entirely new? Can we just throw these rules out? And what they come to is a sense of who they are as a community. That's what they base their decision on. It's not a matter of whether the rule actually is right or wrong. It comes down to who they are as a people. And I think that's what you're doing here. And I think that's what a lot of secular humanist groups are doing in America right now. You're clarifying your identity. You're talking about what you believe, and you're saying this is who we are as a community. And sometimes it can be very difficult, I think, to determine what rules are going to govern that when your identity is still forming. But I think we think about rules as being a place of safety, and we think about rules in our lives as governing things and keeping everybody safe and happy, and we miss the fact that we really admire rule breakers. I mean, the people that we really think of as innovators and people that we talk about, the people that we see biographies about on TV, they're not people who stuck with the rules and just did everything the way that they were supposed to do. You may know the legend about the Gordian knot. This might be one of the oldest rule breakers that we admire. Alexander the Great is conquering the world, and he comes across this place where an ancient king, Gordius, had tied this complex knot. This is like way beyond Boy Scout badges. And for centuries, this knot had been here, and the legend was that whoever could untie this knot would rule the world. And people had tried, and everybody had failed. And Alexander came up, so the legend goes, and he looked at this knot, and he could not see a way to untie it, and so he drew his sword and sliced through the rope, and it fell away. And that was not perhaps what people had in mind when they thought about untying a knot. But then he went on and conquered the world, so maybe he was But the lesson there is not that we can conquer the world by breaking rules, but that we don't necessarily have to follow the rules of the game. We sometimes can find different ways to accomplish the things that are meaningful to us, the things that we value. Unitarian Universalists are big on the transcendental writers, so I'm going to throw a transcendental writer in here. Henry David Thoreau, you may be familiar with him. Regarding rules, he said, "Any fool can make a rule, and every fool will mind it." So I'm hoping that we can be less foolish and think about folks like Galileo and Copernicus, who broke some rules that wound up defining the way that we see the universe. People like Rosa Parks and Clara Barton. There was just last year there was a biography that came out about Rosa Parks that revealed, perhaps for the first time for some folks, that she lived a life of rule breaking. She didn't just break a rule by sitting down in a certain seat on a certain bus on a certain day. She lived her life breaking rules that she thought were unjust. Some people think she was the most influential woman of the second half of the 20th century, and I don't know that I could disagree. But there are a lot of people who are breaking rules in other parts of the world, women who are breaking the rules of their society through microfinancing or through educational endeavors. If you read Half the Sky, or just watch the movie, if some of you are not big on reading, Half the Sky talks about these phenomenal women in places where their society says that they are lesser human beings. And they're doing things to break those stereotypes and to break the rules so that they have justice and so that they have equity. And I think those kinds of stories are inspiring to us. Even our American pride has all of these inventors in our history, the Wright brothers, Thomas Edison, Henry Ford, even more recently, folks like Steve Jobs. We think of them as being these innovators that we admire, even if we don't admire everything about their lives. They weren't all pleasant people. sometimes we overlook the suffering that they went through, and sometimes we overlook the suffering that they inflicted on other people because we really admire their innovation. We admire that they were able to break some rules and accomplish something that other people weren't able to accomplish. In the arts, my master's and doctorate in music certainly exposed me to a lot of avant-garde rule breakers that nobody's ever heard of as composers, unless you just are one of those elite people that likes avant-garde music. But all the classical music that we remember were people who break rules. Beethoven, Debussy, Gershwin. I mean, these guys were not following the rules of how you're supposed to write music. People criticized them right and left because they weren't doing it right. But they're the ones that we remember. So there's something to this idea of breaking rules. Even if we don't want to emulate those people in every area of their lives, we really admire that they were able to break some rules. So let's think a little bit more about the rules that we invent for ourselves. I think that one of the biggest forms that this takes are vows that we make. And by vow, I mean, I'm never going to be like my parents. That would be a vow. I'll never get taken advantage of again. That's a vow that I think some people make. They're very useful at some point. We make those vows because we have a reason in our lives to make those vows. We don't just wake up one morning and say, oh, you know what? I think I'm going to make a vow about how I'm going to live the rest of my life. We experience something, and out of a sense of maybe needing to protect ourselves, we make some kind of a vow. And at a certain point, I think we stop being thoughtful about those vows. And when we start being thoughtless in the way that we're living our lives, I think we have a tendency to do harm to ourselves and to people around us. We invent these rules and then we try to apply them to every relationship or every circumstance, and it just doesn't work. Boundaries that we set are a kind of rule too. We set boundaries in the relationships that we have, but when we try to use those boundaries to protect ourselves absolutely and thoughtlessly, then we're really letting our fear govern our lives more than our deep guiding principles. So I've mentioned a couple of vows. I saw some shaking heads and all of that. Are there other vows that you've heard of someone, not you of course, but somebody, you have a friend who's maybe made a vow? I'll never move away from the microphone in that direction.
It's just so far from the mic, I gather everything.
I'm sorry.
I promise I will never give you feedback.
So I'm not necessarily asking for you to make a vow. I'm just asking if there are other vows that you have heard people make that have struck you as something that may be thoughtlessly followed at a certain point.
I'll never date another redhead.
I'll never date another redhead. Yeah. We'll just move on from that one. Okay. We make these kind of, oh, did you say?
Well, I mean, so I watched How I Met Your Mother, and last week's episode was all about this vow of, I will never get that drunk again. And then they do a flash forward to every single one of them getting that drunk again.
I will never get that drunk again. So sometimes we make vows and then we don't allow them to be rules in our lives. That also happens. I think that rules are very useful to us because at a certain level they let us be lazy. We don't have to think about every situation because we've got this rule that we're going to follow. I'm never going to be like my mother. What was my mother like? Okay, now I know. I don't have to really think. I can be lazy about the situations that I get in. But also to protect us. I mean, if we say, I'm never going to date another redhead, there's a reason there. We feel like we need to protect ourselves from that reality of what redheads are. You know, we need to be able to say, you know, I'll never be taken advantage of again because we think we have to protect ourselves from something. And sometimes we might think we need to be safe in society. You know, these rules like don't talk to strangers. We don't necessarily get to control what other people do. So, it's probably a fear-driven rule to say don't talk to strangers. But then what happens when a stranger talks to you? It's fine to say I'm never going to offend anyone with anything that I say or do, but you don't really get to control whether somebody's going to feel offended. Some things are out of our hands. Sometimes we assume some things that aren't true. And we get frustrated when our rules don't work the way we want them to. We can't decide whether somebody else is going to be offended or upset by our actions, but we can choose to speak out of our own deep beliefs, or we can choose to stay silent. We can't choose somebody else's behavior. We can choose to be authentic in our identity, or we can choose to let other people's beliefs be more important than our own. But we're the ones making that choice. As convenient as rules might be, though, they cause some problems. If you read a book like You're Not So Smart by David McRaney, he talks about a lot of these kinds of rules that we make in our lives. He doesn't refer to them like that, but he talks about things like Milgram's experiment that you may have heard of. Milgram, several decades ago, set up this experiment, and volunteers came in, and they were put in front of a machine that had knobs on it, and it was hooked up to some wires, and they were told that there was somebody in an adjoining room that they would be delivering an electric shock to whenever that person got an answer wrong. And at the far end of the dial, there were some warnings, that an electric shock of that magnitude could cause harm or even could kill somebody. But because there was somebody in a lab coat with a clipboard standing there as an authority figure telling the volunteers, go ahead, a remarkable number of people thought, the person in the other room was making noises and sounds, but they weren't really being electrocuted. But the volunteer thought that they were delivering some really dangerous amounts of electricity to the person in the other room just because there was an authority figure standing there saying, it's okay, I give you permission. This idea of always obeying authority figures might be a rule that we need to question. There's also this documented effect called the Bystander Effect. I think Ray Bradbury may have even written a short story about it. But there's this thing that we do where the larger the number of people are that see someone in distress, the less likelihood it is that any one of those people will do something to help. If you break down on the side of a lonely country road, you're more likely to get help than if you break down on a busy Houston freeway. Because we have this rule that says, I'm not obligated to help if there are other people around. And you know that this works even with emails, because if you've ever sent an email asking for help with something to 20 people, you probably didn't get any reply. But if you sent one email to that one person that you knew would respond to it, you got a reply maybe instantly. We think, oh, well, one of these other 19 people is going to reply, I don't need to worry about this. But if you just ask me, well, I've got to make a decision one way or the other. So we have these strange rules, like brand loyalty. We decide that what we have spent money on in the past, we must like that, because if we bought something foolishly, then that says something about our intelligence or our ability to make decisions. So we prefer things that we own, and I think we prefer things that we believe because we rationalize our past choices. We want to protect our sense of self. And I think that has a lot to do with some of the religious belligerence that is in the world today. People don't really want to think about what they believe, because if they've already decided that they believe this thing, then they're going to have to admit that they were foolish to have believed that in the first place. There's this cognitive dissonance. I don't want to admit that I was foolish, and therefore I'm going to stick to my guns, and this is what I believe, and you can't convince me otherwise. And that could work for atheists as much as it could work for people with faith beliefs. If we're unwilling to really consider the stances that we're taking, the beliefs that we have, then we can put ourselves in a situation where we're being thoughtless about what we're doing, what we're claiming. So why don't we just make better rules? It would seem like there are just some rules that are the problem, and we can just make some better rules and everything would be better. But I'm not sure what those rules would look like. Never obey authority? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I'll always get taken advantage of. There would have to be some really convoluted rules if we were going to invent better rules. But whatever they were, those rules would still have the potential to let us be lazy about our decisions. They would give us an excuse to play victim, because if you followed the rules and things didn't work out the way you wanted it to, then life just isn't fair. I did everything right. I did everything just by the book, and then nobody likes my music. And then I didn't get to have the kind of relationship that I wanted, or then I didn't get the kind of job that I wanted. So now, poor me. I think rules sometimes hinder our opportunities to be the best possible versions of ourselves because they let us be thoughtless. They make our actions more about obligation and restriction rather than any kind of purposeful intentionality. So I'd like to suggest that there's something better than just following rules. And you've already got a framework for that here. And I think your guiding principles about what you believe set the stage for this. There's nothing there that lets you know exactly how to behave in any circumstance. There's not a rule up there, really. But there are some ideas, some principles that say, here's what we believe, here's the framework for who we are. It's based on an intentional identity that the community has chosen. And you may have some guiding principles in your own life that look a lot like that, or they might look different. Your personal guiding principles might be something that's engaged you in a lot of introspection, and you've thought very hard about it. But introspection is tough. We're not really trained to be introspective. Being thoughtful is something that isn't just an inborn ability of human beings, it's a skill that gets developed. And knowing your guiding principles might take a bit of time. I think having a community of people really helps with that. Because if you're just thinking about, well, what's my identity? What do I really believe? What are my guiding principles for my life? Then it might be a lot easier to determine that if you have someone to bounce those ideas off of. Someone to help you clarify some things. And I think there are a lot of people in this room that would be good at that. Helping you clarify what you really believe in, what you want to base your actions, what you want to base your decisions on. I'll say one thing about what I think is healthy. Guiding principles that are healthy are not based on fear. Healthy guiding principles are not based on fear. I think a lot of the rules and the vows that we make are fear-based. But if we think about what really matters to us most, what we really value, we have to get underneath fear to really see what that is. Our guiding principles express who we most want to be in the world. They express that vision of a best possible version of ourselves. And I don't think fear is involved with that. Guiding principles don't give us automatic responses, but they provide a framework for thoughtful decision making. If you say that people are more important than beliefs, you have to be thoughtful about what that means in a particular relationship, in a particular conversation, in a particular argument even. But we need some rules in our lives. We can't mull over every decision because we'd be paralyzed. So we need to understand why we're following the rules that we're following. Once we understand how to be intentional about applying our guiding principles to the way that we're living our lives, then I think those rules take on a different meaning for us. Simply asking, why am I choosing to do this from time to time, can be a really great way to bring things back into focus. When we know why we're choosing to follow rules, even following traffic laws becomes different. Because if I'm only following traffic laws because I don't want to get a ticket, that's kind of a fear-based self-preservation kind of thing. But if I recognize that I have a guiding principle that means that I really care about the well-being of other people, then suddenly I'm following those traffic laws because I want to be safe, because I value my own well-being, and I want the people around me to be safe because I value their well-being. And it's not just about not getting a ticket or what I can get away with, but it's about who I am as an individual. If we're choosing to give money to an organization because we feel guilty or because we feel like we owe it to them or we're obligated or whatever, then that's different than if we recognize that we're generous people and that my identity is somebody who believes in abundance and I'm a generous person and therefore I'm going to give out of that identity. That's different. Your actions might be the same thing, but when it comes out of a sense of those guiding principles, it takes on a deeper meaning. I have one more example, but I think that's good enough. So, you want another example? Sam Harris wrote a little book called Lying. It's a really short read, and I encourage you to take a look at it if you haven't. It's like 76 pages, I think. And he talks about this idea that you should always tell the truth. And in Sam Harris's book, it becomes kind of a rule. You know, you should never tell a lie. That's the rule. When I think about that, I think about, well, why is it that I would choose to always tell the truth? Instead of just making that a rule that I'll thoughtlessly follow, why is it good for me to tell the truth even when it's difficult or even when it's painful? And I had this little thought experiment that I asked some people to do a little while back, and I said, okay, if you are a mediocre musician at best, you can only stumble through pieces, and you decide that you're going to go and get a job as a musician, that's going to be your career. You're going to go and be a money-making musician, and nobody will hire you. You go to audition after audition, and you stumble through the same couple of pieces, and nobody will hire you to be a musician. And so you sit down with your friend and say, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with these people that are not hearing the value of what I'm doing? Let me play through these things. And you stumble through your audition pieces. What would you rather your friend say? Something like, you're awesome. Just keep going at it, man. Somebody will hire you. Would you rather your friend say absolutely nothing? Or would you rather your friend say, you either need to practice a little harder or do something other than being a musician? That might not be what you really want to hear, but the actual ramifications in your life are going to be profoundly different if your friend is honest with you. And I have a feeling in my life that the people who are honest with me don't do it just because they have a rule to always be honest. They're honest with me because of the relationship that they have with me, because of an identity that they have about who they are in that relationship, and because they believe something about who I am to them. It's deeper than just following a rule. So I want to be the kind of person who's honest with everybody, and who's also tactful in the way that I'm honest with people, because just being honest is not a rule that I want to follow, but it comes out of a respect for people. It comes out of a desire for other people's well-being. And when it comes from that, then the way that I am honest is part of that. So it's not just about following a rule, it's about having an identity and living that identity authentically. Thank you very, very much. It's been a joy to be here.
Thank you so much, Randy. It gives a lot to think about. I thought about some of my vows. Like whenever I hear of someone I know of that has a heart attack or has to have a stent put in or a bypass and they have heart issues, I make a vow never to eat bacon again. It lasts like 2 days. It's a short-term vow. Yeah, but he gives a lot to chew on. Thank you so much.